Hey everyone, it's vmcampos, comic book fan. Welcome to another episode of the weekly vmcampos Comic Book Club. This is the series where I answer the question, what am I reading this week? For the audio version of the podcast, head on over to your favorite podcasting app and subscribe. In this series, I review a comic book new or old from my collection on the following dimensions: cover art, interior art, plot, and enjoyability of the book on a scale of 1 to 5. Now, spoiler alert, I will be going through the various pages of this book, but you are encouraged to always purchase the book yourself, visit your favorite comic book shops, and buy the books I review. Help support your favorite creators and companies. It's really worth it. This week I'm reading Critters #1, published by Fantagraphics Books in 1986. Let's get started. Alright, so I've got an issue #1 of a comic book. This covers perfectly one of my favorite niches, black and white independent furry comics from the 1980s. So this is an anthology comic book published by Fantagraphics in 1985 that has 3 stories by various furry creators that were big names in the 80s. We've got a story by Stan Sakai, Joshua Quagmire, and Steve Gallacci. So this is issue #1 of a series that went on to 50 issues all throughout the 80s. It is a seminal work of independent publishing, anthology publishing, black and white publishing, furry comic publishing. So let's talk about it. The cover features an ensemble of the various characters in the book: Steve Gallacci's Alphon from Birthright, Stan Sakai's USAGI YOJIMBO from that comic, Kelly O'Hare and Domino from Joshua Quagmire. It's got this wonderful gradient in the background, so this is coloring by Tom Luth. And it's kind of a fun cover. I give it a 4 out of 5 in terms of it. It's just kind of a disjointed sort of thing. Everyone's showing off their creations on the cover. There's no big cohesiveness to it. It's just, hey, everyone, we're here, issue #1. So I'll give it a 4 out of 5. Each particular artist contributes their own style to their own particular characters, and then Tom Luth colors it all. Tom Luth worked with Stan Sakai for years and years and years. So this is published in 1986 after Quagmire's Cutie Bunny had been out for a while, since the early 80s. Steve Gallacci's Albedo universe has been around since 1983, and Stan Sakai's USAGI YOJIMBO since 84. So this comic book was going to be an anthology for all of those, plus more independent voices in the furry comics publishing universe. So it's a pretty cool cover, 4 out of 5. Interior art. Well, there are 3 creators in the book, so kind of 3 different styles. We've got Stan Sakai on his USAGI YOJIMBO one-shot story, Joshua Quagmire and Dave Garcia on their Cutie Bunny-ish, not really Cutie Bunny story, and then we've got Stephen A. Gallacci on his Birthright Chapter 1. So each story is very good. It's black and white art. As you can see, the USAGI YOJIMBO art, as usual, is amazing. Full disclosure, I like Sakai's earlier rendition of USAGI YOJIMBO. His latest style in USAGI YOJIMBO is technically good, but I just love the old black and white aspect of it. So there's like a very frenetic scene of a battle that is just hyperkinetic. There's so much swordplay, slashing, blood, death, and you don't quite get lost because Sakai's penmanship is just superb, that is able to differentiate characters with black and white, line work, hatching, cross-hatching, thickness of line. It works very well. Shadows. So Sakai, his particular story, it's a 5 out of 5. It's just amazing. He's an incredible draftsman. So I love this early USAGI art. Joshua Quagmire's, I like it less. It's a little bit too kind of like dirty. That's not the right word, but it's like too cluttered in a way. I don't know. I don't love his work in general, so I'll give it a 4 out of 5. it's a good quality, but I think I'm just being too affected by the actual story of this particular comic, so I'll get to that in a moment. But on a technical level, his art is good. It's very cartoony, and I'm always a fan of that, but I didn't quite love it. So I'm giving it a 4 out of 5. But you can see for yourself and decide what you think about it. It is visually interesting. There's an interesting multi-panel layout with some grim things happening, and you can decide for yourself how you would rate this art. And lastly, we've got Steve Gallacci's Birthright art. This is beautiful, black and white in with pen and ink washes. This is amazing. This is a 5 out of 5. There are some highlights in white that really look really nice to contrast. There are several spots, however, of just plain backgrounds, which often happen in furry comics. Like the author often seems to focus on the main characters, and then the backgrounds kind of fall by the wayside. However, there are some great shots of the action going on. The battle that is raging, the whole complex is rendered well. Again, the tones are excellent. There's some great shots of light coming through smoke, and the expressions on the characters, they're really fleshed out well. You can see their expressions of fear and confusion, determination. This is truly the style that I wish to emulate myself. And so Gallacci's work here, it's a 5 out of 5 on the art rating. The plot. Okay, 3 different plots again. Usagi's plot, it's a 5 out of 5. It's classic Stan Sakai wandering rabbit bodyguard story. Usagi is contracted by a bounty hunter to be his bodyguard. He just needs another sword at his side to capture the 2 brothers. Actually, not even capture them, to kill them because of what has transpired before them. So there's some great fun wordplay between them at the beginning when they meet at the ramen house. Eventually they do form a partnership. They argue, they laugh, and then they become partners to go take down these bad guys. There's some amazing swordplay, beautifully rendered art. There's some twists and turns. The story is great. It's a 5 out of 5. There's a humorous ending, as these Usagi stories often have, and eventually Usagi would go on to his own comic, but he appeared several times in Thoughts and Images' Albedo, where he debuted. Then he was in Critters for a while, and then he came to his own comics and has been published for 35 years. A new issue number 1 debuted recently, which is amazing. I'm picking it up, of course. I do love the black and white version of things, however, and the plot, though, is still as good as ever. Interestingly, the Joshua Quagmire story, there's a note right at the beginning, and it's also mentioned by Kim Thompson, the publisher of the book. So Quagmire says, "This is not the story I had originally intended to present here, and due to a difference of opinion, this is also the last and only story I'll be doing for this publication." So apparently there was some bad blood that happened between Quagmire and Thompson, some contractual things I'm sure, and so Quagmire did submit a story that is not at all what you would expect from his usual funny, cutie bunny, superhero parody furry comic. It has an interlude of comedy, but then the bookends of the story are a very depressing war story with the main character dying in a nuclear bomb explosion. So Quagmire submits this story where the main character dies on the first issue as a big middle finger to the publisher. I don't know what happened at all. I didn't do the research to find out, and I kind of don't want to. I want the mystique to be in my mind about what happened between Quagmire and Thompson that caused this animosity with this really depressing out-of-character story to be published on issue 1 of this brand new funny animal anthology series. Thompson himself in the editorial mentions, a side note, I admit that even I was taken a little aback by the dark mood of this premiere issue, helped along with the wistfulness of the first half of this editorial, I'm afraid. This is coincidence. Quagmire's unexpectedly bleak fantasy, replacing what was intended to be a typically waka 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 cutie epic, plays off the premiere of Birthright, out of structural necessity of somewhat downbeat introduction, with the mayhem of Sakai's samurai strip providing a somewhat grim levity. So all of the stories here in this first issue of this funny animal comic book are pretty grim. USAGI's is the most comedic of them, but it's still got a lot of violence. And then Quagmire's is totally depressing. So for that, I don't know how to rate the Quagmire part. The grim parts of it, I'll give it a 5 out of 5 as a big, like, sad, interesting story. But then it's juxtaposed with, like, the usual silly cutie bunny stuff, which I'm not as big as a fan that I thought I would be of it. And so I don't know what to rate this. Like, for the comedy aspect, I'll give it a 2 out of 5. But for the grim aspect, I'll give this story a 5 out of 5. And lastly, Gallacci's Birthright. This is a 5 out of 5. Stephen A. Gallacci is an amazing artist and writer that has created his magnum opus of Albedo Anthropomorphics and its spin-off Birthright, which happens hundreds of years after the original Irma Felna Albedo story. And it's basically a war epic, political thriller, very well researched, very well drawn. There's kind of a lot of spelling mistakes, unfortunately, sometimes in Gallacci's work, but I can forgive that. And again, the art is beautiful, the characters are fleshed out. This first story introduces the main characters, the royal family, and how they're deposed. I love some of these introductions here. As the techno-economic condition deteriorated, many of the freedoms and opportunities previously enjoyed could no longer be maintained. The new orders were often supported by force, which in turn encouraged cycles of revolution. Shartoa, under the Kashoka prince's rule, had managed some measure of stability for its people and security on its borders, but Prince Anton, intent on international economic cooperative, fails to attend to domestic unrest and the hostile Tosiu. So it's Gallacci's work is very dense. It's a lot to read. It's a lot to take in. There's many facets, many characters. It's amazing. I'm saddened and surprised that the works of Albedo are not as well known as they could be. 35 years later, the story is still relevant and interesting. Political machinations, the cowardice of politicians, the heroism of the armed forces, but with their own mental problems, post-traumatic stress disorders, the thrust of destiny, the agony of defeat, Pyrrhic victories, and still people, even though they're funny animals, live and learn and die and grow in these stories. It is a really deep, wonderful story. Perfect 5 out of 5 for part 1 of Birthright. This was a wonderful book to read this week. So once again, the audio version of this video is available at your favorite podcasting locations. Search vmcampos and subscribe. I'm all over the place. Spotify, Google Play, Pandora, etc. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and rate there. Don't forget to join the Patreon, patreon.com/vmcampos. You'll get access to exclusive things, such as my Top Comic Book Picks of the Week video series. Or simply follow, like, comment. That's all for free. Tell me what you thought about this comic. I'd love to hear it. Did you ever read it back in the day? Are you interested in reading it now? Let me know. If you go to my Patreon and become part of the VMC crew, at the $2 range, I'll actually mail you a comic book from my curated collection as a thanks for supporting me. Well, this week I read Critters #1, published by Fantagraphics Books in 1986. This has been the weekly VM Campos Comic Book Club, and I'll see you next week.